I think it's from my studio. Qamelliah should be going next. So
Okay.
just like a
That's good.
brief introduction, my studio is about the official diary from 2030, where the main protagonist wakes up in the year of 2030 and then finding out about the future. And yeah, Qamelliah, if you're ready with the project, you can start sharing.
Oh, yes, I'm ready. Good morning, guys. Let me share my screen. Okay, I'll just give a brief overview of everything from the beginning of the project. So visual diary from 2030, and my project has three narratives. The first one is Layla and the Lighthouse, which looks at a human scale and human perspectives. The second narrative, which is in an urban scale, doesn't really have a name, but it looks at the interventions that occur within this reality that I've set up. And the third narrative is at a planetary scale, and it looks at the wide scale, I suppose, contextual background of my project and how my human has come to be where she is in 2030. Okay, so the first narrative, Layla and the Lighthouse, at the human scale, is we see her wake up or come into consciousness in the moment where humans have abandoned Earth. So everybody's gone in like these spaceships, and she doesn't know where she is, and she's lost her memory, and she's the only person left on Earth. And this begins in 2030. The second narrative is Dearly Departed, which tells a story of how humans have come to abandon Earth. So it starts, I suppose, now, up until 2030 and beyond. And it tells a story of a super solar storm, which hits Earth in 2022. And it critically damages critical infrastructures at, I suppose, every layer of the Earth and its atmosphere. And in this critical damage, you see a lot of like things happen. Let me see. Okay, so I began with some research into solar storms and like ones that have happened in the past, such as the Carrington event, which was a massive solar flare with the energy of 10 billion atomic bombs, and it disrupted the like newly established electrical lines. And in 2012, we actually narrowly missed an event that was equivalent to this Carrington event that happened in the 19th century. And my story then becomes into like a more speculative and fictional reality where this solar storm is predicted and then eventually happens in 2022. And because there was a time gap between the prediction and when the event actually occurred, some people were actually able to prepare for it, which is why these Exodus ships where humans abandon Earth kind of survived, even though the solar storm affected electrical systems. And in 2030 is when people abandoned Earth, but left some survivors on Earth, and these survivors are called the compromised, which is kind of where the time travel thing happens. So the compromised are survivors whose electrical impulses in the brain have actually been altered because of the solar flare, and this wiped their past and allows them to time travel to this 2030 where they've woken up and they found themselves as the only people left on Earth. So in the urban scale, my site is Newcastle, and there's three main locations. There was four, but there's three now. The first location is the bridge, which is where Layla first wakes up. And I should mention that this solar flare also affects like climate. So the climate is still changing because of the effects of human activities in the past like few hundred years. Yes. So like the sea levels are still rising. The solar flare also affects like the climate. So there's a lot of like weather changes and these kind of like shifts in the landscape. And when she wakes up in location 1, she takes this journey down the River Tyne, where she comes across location 2, which is at this urban scale where humans have begun to adapt like structures into like dwellings and other spaces so they could live in that time period between 2022 when the solar event happens and 2030 when everybody leaves. And her journey ends at the Lighthouse, which is where she has found home. So this is her dwelling, or where she makes her home. Yes. So this is just an image of the 3 locations together, and like there's quite a lot of distance between the 3 locations. So also a mode of travel for her is she goes by boat because the river level is rising and everything is all overgrown and not really walkable. So this river is her main route. So it begins here in location 1, which is in progress. I've only just managed to model the bridge, but this is where she wakes up, and this is the view she sees. Yes. And location 2 is an industrial area off the river, and this place is kind of like a massive construction site where, because all the essential personnel have kind of shifted their focus onto leaving the planet, you're left with, I suppose, the normal people or the people who aren't deemed as essential to create like spaces for living in these structures, because the ground is no longer inhabitable, because the water is rising and things are very unstable on the normal ground level. So this location, you've got these structures which are actually offshore wind turbines, and they're usually like transported by boat into the sea, and then you've got the wind turbines that are slotted inside, and then they create the energy. But because all of that is down, there's not really any need for electricity anymore, because all the systems of like distribution and what's the word? Anyway, all these systems are down, so like these structures are no longer deemed as necessary, so that they've also just been left there to be abandoned. So this is where the construction sites happen, and also the growth of like nature coming back into these spaces because of human abandonment, and the simultaneous degrowth or decay of these structures are happening. We looked at Grasshopper Modeling just to see how I can model the growth that happens in this site. Yes, and like how we can possibly use nature and like morph it in a way that it becomes like a secondary structure to the structure that is existing, so humans can create spaces within. So I've been creating and modeling this site of intervention, sort of curating how it would look post solar storm, from like existing images, and then also from my imagination how things would fall apart and decay, and then how humans would create connections between the structures and also spaces within them as well. So you've got the sequential, I suppose, growth. I mean, this is like hundreds of years from now, but sort of like what would happen at different timescales towards these structures. I mean, the spaces are developing right now, but this is sort of what I imagine them to look like in the decades, hundreds of years after. And then finally, after she's witnessed and seen all that happens here, Layla then approaches her third location, which is the Lighthouse. And based on the lessons that she learns of living and surviving in this site that the humans that were left over did in that 8-year period. She takes the lessons that she learns from this site and she applies them onto the lighthouse, which is where she has, I suppose, found home. Yeah, that's it for my presentation.
Thank you, Qamelliah.
Thank you.
I like the development on the buildings. I think it will be helpful to add a few human beings on this to show the scale as well.
Yeah, I like this sequence of images. I think it's coming together really nicely, and yeah, it's just need to produce the images to complete the project, because I'm quite I think the narratives are quite convincing to me, and also I like the how it turns out to be something that's quite the way of approaching the project is quite playful, but at the same time it's based on an event that is it's going to happen, right? It's just when is it going to happen? So yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, from the very first few slides, I'm already quite convinced with this narrative. Just want to see where you're going to take us. It's quite good. And the ending, maybe like the lighthouse, is what is that going to be more of it, or that will be the ending of this project, sort of like open ending?
I was thinking it would be an open ending, so just her alone in this world that she's created for herself. And I mean, I think Alan mentioned it in the last review. This, I suppose, whole project is, I suppose, a letter, like a visual diary, but also like a letter to the humans that have abandoned Earth. So the narrative Dearly Departed, it speaks to the humans that have abandoned Earth, and it's almost like calling them back and telling them that it's not, like, the situation isn't hopeless. I suppose there's new forms of architecture that can arise from hopeless situations. So it is open-ended, but it's also like a romantic, thing.
One thing I think you could do to progress the project is I'd pick a couple of books that have similar kind of narratives, call it post-apocalyptic, whatever it is, and just study the story structure. And then I would mimic it in the way that you tell your story. So what you'll probably find is that there's an opening, there's a character development, and then the character in your instance is architecture. But then in narratives, there's always like a build up to an event, and then a gigantic event, and then, the closing of an event. It's basically just like a wave, right? And I think you could mimic that structure in your presentation, so that when you're delivering your presentation, you build up and you build up and you build up, and your climax of the presentation, I think, is kind of it's the tipping point from when regrowth becomes degrowth. So there's no longer a surplus of built environment, but actually it flips, and now there's actually more nature than built environment. And then you kind of ease off the narrative, and as you're kind of progressing through your project, it will also help you figure out what key moments you want to really clearly illustrate. So for example, if this image here is the build up to that crescendo of the turning point, then you know already what you need to populate it with, and you can take tips from one of the narratives that you found to see what they do, and then apply it to your presentation.
Yeah, I actually think the narrative is really poetic and it's quite beautiful. I also like the kind of almost like a metaphor or symbolism behind the architecture, where you, for example, like how the lighthouse almost becomes, this idea of hope or wishful thinking at the end. It just reminds me of so I got this book here by Lebbe's Wood. You can see my.
Yeah.
I think what's quite interesting is that how he managed to organize all the drawings and models into quite a cinematic kind of narrative. Sorry, it's just very hard to. But you see how he. Can you see it, by the way?
Yes.
So basically, each of these, it becomes almost like a sequential drawing of the project, but it's very cinematic. So basically, you have, for example, one view of the whole structure, and then suddenly you slowly zoom into it. So the whole project becomes very fictional, but it is very clear and very sort of efficient in telling the whole idea of the sequence and the narrative. So you see how this. So yeah, I just think this would be a very good reference for you in terms of how you can arrange the drawings in that kind of cinematic sense. Yeah.
What's the name of the book?
Yeah.
What's the name of the book?
It's Lebbe's Wood. It's this one, and then it's published by
Aranova. Okay.
Yeah. So basically, it's this.
Okay, cool.
I'll add that in the chat later on. But yeah.
So yeah, I think Qamelliah also in one of the to-do items is a survival handbook.
Yes.
Yes, and I think it will be beneficial to look at the reference. I think that's a good one.
Wait, so that's the time artifact of
Yes.
the
Yes.
project? Okay, I see.
Hello. I have a reference idea. Maybe I'm not sure it's gonna be too late for this stage, but anyway, for your consideration or maybe another layer of thinking in your narrative. Your issue about this solar flame. I'm not sure how your research goes, but is that gonna change the temperature of our environment dramatically, or just the radiation that causes problem?
I was actually not researching into that, but I was actually thinking about that, specifically possibly having different temperatures within like different areas.
Yeah, I'm trying to say that if you I saw your narrative. You have elements such as these bridges, as well as these rivers, as a lighthouse, and the seas. So actually, water is kind of important elements in your drawings or narrative or your design. And actually, if we know that this water, kind of a liquid water status, is actually a very rare or precious status of this material, because along the whole spectrum of the temperatures actually can only happen in the right pressures, in a right atmosphere pressures, that they can only stay as liquid from 0 Celsius to the 100 Celsius. But the majority of this temperature is either too cold or too hot. So most of these materials are contained in either solid status or the gas status. So maybe I'm not sure if you're thinking about this solar status, either the solar flare or kind of this gas giant gonna be hotter and hotter to expand. So this might impact about the sea level a lot, I assume. So, for example, Venus used to have a similar status as Earth before, but due to this overrun greenhouse effect, it actually boils out. It always liquid form water. So I'm not sure if this kind of a level changes that might happen and what it can impact to your narrative, and how is that going to be a more interesting element to look at, or it's going to be a obstacle that for your story. Maybe you can just for your thoughts potentially might be helpful for your another layer of interesting story, the elements that you can tell. Just yeah.
Building upon that, I think is it really a question for you? It's not really a comment. It's just like, do you intend to present the project to non-architects or architects only? If you want to engage with the larger audience, then I have a question. Like, where's Layla? Are we ever going to see your character? I think for non-architects, like a character will really help them to just find their emotions or locations within your narrative.
Mm-hmm.
David wants Layla and the companion.
I think David makes sense. You have because essentially it can be as simple as putting Layla into some of these drawings. So my comment to your project is, I think overall your narrative is actually very nice. It has a good flow. I don't know if you saw some of my comment on your midterm review, because I didn't join, but I looked at your presentation. I think compared to that, your narrative is more linear now and more grounded rather than a bit too vague and more diverse, because this gives you a little bit more control into building towards your design. So I think it's good. So major comment I would put is because I feel lost and disconnected away from you when you're telling your story or your narrative towards all this imagery, because these imagery you're showing now, it doesn't have the cinematic, the magical aesthetics of the feeling of the narrative to what you're telling. So to do that, it can be as simple as, let's say, putting anything in some context to these model or the site. For example, if you go to one of the slides that I can see a little bit the building like next to it. So if you I think go up or down, I don't know which side. Yeah, something like this. So I'm not talking about the quality of lighting, rendering, and all that. When I say content, it can be just download some of the model, like with building structure or with texture, to place around the building, place around the surrounding, and then have some event, have some life happening in here. So I know that in that year, many people died already, but there is still some movement. There is still some trees or whatever, some background into a imagery like this. Because if you create a scene, just like taking reference from the book Ivan was showing you, all this cinematic, all this voice conceptual idea, or the view, the mood that they created with these kind of conceptual art, if you put these elements in, it will help me or help the audience to imagine your narrative a lot easier and tie it back to the theme. Because otherwise, in the beginning, you have a very nice, you present your narrative really nicely, but it then becomes very pale and faded as I was looking into your model, because it doesn't have that aesthetics feeling, that moody feeling. And yeah, it's all it actually.
Yeah, I think also if you're adding back the character in, and then you can start to think about, okay, is this drawing going to be almost like a first-person view or third-person view? So you start to switch the angle of the drawing as well. So you might actually go into this tower and actually look up. So that might be another kind of drawing that you can explore. So I think if you start to develop all these drawings, to kind of bring out the narrative. I think it will be a really interesting project to see. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, are you imagining when you are doing the final presentation, are you still going through the first few slides where you explain like why you think that is a topic here? Like, are you still going to present this way, or are you going to start right with your narrative without those, you know, those setup or the structure behind of making the narrative work? Yeah, so almost like I think what I'm hearing from all other tutors is like now it's time to look at production, and it's about how you produce your narrative without explaining.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, the way I imagined it was in a first-person perspective, and then I suppose, but then also placing Layla within it, because it would help non-architect reviewers to view my drawings in that way. But in terms of specifically this location, you wouldn't actually see Layla within it. It's more of a reflection on the past people that lived here and like actually create these structures. So placing people in it, of course, but in a more like ghost-like way, as opposed to.
Is Layla actually a person or what? Maybe I've missed that in the.
Yeah, she's not actually a person. I mean, she is a person, but she's not actually a person. She's. I don't know. So I mean, the way I wrote the story before I actually started this workshop, she's just like a consciousness that comes into being. We don't know if she's human or not. But as I developed,
Layla is like herself, or
pardon?
Like is all these buildings, all these structures?
Yes.
Is that or is that another character?
No, Layla is a living being. So I mean, the simplest answer would probably be yes, she is a human.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
No, the reason I'm asking is I'm just wondering, is also like some of these buildings or structures that you create, are they also part of the characters in your story? Because if you look at, for example, John Hayduke Victims, so he designed this memorial park in Berlin, and he has like 26 buildings in the park, and each of the buildings he assigned like a characters to them. You can have a look. It's quite a beautiful project, but it just reminds me of that, and I'm just thinking, maybe your some of your buildings, could be the character, themselves. I mean, I'm not saying like, you have to change anything, but I'm just thinking, if you need a character or if you need to sort of incorporate the protagonist into it, can your architecture actually becomes the character themselves? Even in terms of, how you present, the project. Yeah.
I think because you have the journey, it will make sense to add more animation and the kind of immersive experience and first-person perspective, like all of the tutors mentioned. And I mean, I could almost see the first scene, like slide 1, Layla waking up on a bridge with her hands soaking wet because the flood has reached her level, and then the quickest way to do something first person perspective is to show the hands. So like first person gun shooting games, and like you can wake up seeing the hands, and then it suddenly becomes more than just a rendering. It becomes almost like an immersive experience, and looking from like waking up maybe a bit dizzy from the solar flare. Yeah, I mean, I'm not against the idea of we are all Laylas, but I think it's important to show the kind of immersive experience, and it will be nice if the final presentation could be presenting your survival handbook. Then it's a great way to tell the story with visuals and some of the text in a book. Okay, is there any further comments? If not, we might move on to the next one. Any tutors? Okay, well, thank you, Qamelliah, for the presentation.
Thank you for your
Great
comments.
to see the progress, and congratulations on getting into AA.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So next one up, we have Joya. Joya,